Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our presentation on cybersecurity challenges when buying or selling a business. Are you planning to buy or sell? In all your due diligence, there's some critical things to consider regarding cybersecurity. Our panel today will review some key items and give you a list of things to investigate and look into. I'm Carolyn Powell. I'm the Director of Development here at Tronconi Segarra Associates. Tronconi Segarra Associates is a certified public accounting and business consulting firm, and I'll be your host today. Real quickly, you do have a couple ways to engage with us. There is the toolbar. It should be on your right-hand side. There is a question section. Put your questions in there, and throughout, the panel will answer those and engage with you. And like I mentioned, in the handout section is a copy of today's presentation if you want to follow along. After today's webinar, we'll also send you a quick survey. If you could give us some feedback, let us know if you have any questions. If you want to talk with one of the experts, just put it in there and we will follow up with you. And then this afternoon, I will also send you a recording of the presentation. And again, the handouts if you want to go back and re-listen to anything. So without further ado, let's get started. Mark Ferm is a CPA and partner here at Tronconi Segarra Associates. He's over 25 years of public accounting. His broad range of industry experience that he has helped multinational and domestic companies in the areas of mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, and financial reporting. Michael McCartney is a former investigator with New York State Attorney General's Office, former national director at Avalon Cybersecurity, and now has his own cyber consulting service. He is internationally known as an expert in computer crime investigation, computer forensics, and incident response investigations. Kevin Szczepanski is a partner at Barclay Damon with over 25 years of legal work and expertise. He is a trial and appellate lawyer who practices in the area of insurance coverage, litigation, cybersecurity, and commercial litigation. And Reggie Dejean is a director of operations at Lawley with, again, over 25 years of experience in the insurance industry. He specializes in cybersecurity insurance, errors and omissions insurance, professional liabilities insurance, and directors and officers insurance experience. I'm going to hand it over to Mark to get us started this morning.
Great, thank you, Carolyn, and I'd like to also thank my fellow panelists. Great to have you here today to talk about an important topic. And so really the first question I think that probably a lot of people ask is, why is an accountant on a cybersecurity webinar? And well, one of the things that my firm and myself, we get called very often. We feel like in terms of an acquisition, we're kind of like the Marines. It's either our clients either call us first because it has something to do with financial aspects of a transaction, or a lot of times, Kevin, the attorneys get called, right? There's a lot of legal issues that have to be resolved as part of an acquisition. And so we're usually the first that get called. And one of the most commonly overlooked areas in a transaction is cybersecurity. Really, IT in general. I think IT and human resources are two areas that, for whatever reason, people think that can be taken care of post-transaction. And so IT and cybersecurity being just sort of a subset of that. So in terms of financial considerations, wanted to talk about what are the things that we take a look at. So we're engaged many times on the buy side to look at the financial implications of a transaction, looking at the and valuing the business, evaluating the business from a financial and tax perspective, but also looking at the valuation. How is the business valued? And so where cybersecurity comes into play in regards to diligence is one of the most important things is to try to understand, are there any unrecorded liabilities, any unknown liabilities that have not been disclosed to us as the buyer? That's one of the risks that we take a look at. And how might that impact if there's been a cybersecurity breach? As we all know, that brings along with it a fair amount of liability as well as potential future expenses. And so we like to understand what those risks are and work with our other associates as well as the attorneys, being Kevin, a cybersecurity specialist. You'll hear a little bit from Mike in a little bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about insurance and how might that impact the transaction from an insurance standpoint. So that, in the end, our charge is to understand the valuation of the company and how might it impact EBITDA. Well, if the cybersecurity controls and protocols of a particular business are not up to speed, might that cause a decrease in future earnings? In fact, if they were lacking in the past and additional expenses are required, whether it be through software licenses and enhanced technology support and so forth, how might that have impacted historical earnings? Why does that matter? Well, on a pro forma basis, if our earnings would have been diluted because of these additional expenses, that will reduce the valuation of the business. Looking at projected earnings, how might that impact the projected earnings and also the valuation of the business? Reputational risk, well, why does that matter? Well, some customers, they may get nervous, and if a company has been breached by some kind of cybersecurity issue, customers may leave and not do business with that company anymore. So that would reduce the revenues and earnings of the company and therefore the valuation. And then legal and remediation costs. What are the costs that are going to be incurred to fix an issue, either that has occurred or that is potentially going to occur? And hiring attorneys to fix those issues, as well as some of the remediation costs. I know that Mike may also get into a little bit. And then, lastly, the impact on the acquisition agreement. Many times in a transaction, a seller wants a stock deal. Not always, but many times a seller wants a stock deal. If there is a significant liability that would be carried forward in a stock transaction, a buyer may insist on converting to an asset deal. And that many times comes with it negative tax consequences to the seller. So the advice I'll give sellers too is, as you're readying for sale, also take a look at your cybersecurity, because that's now becoming a more common question that buyers are starting to ask. So some other considerations: future CapEx, capital expenditure requirements. To the extent we need to make investments in internal IT infrastructure, enhanced server capabilities, cybersecurity software that helps us detect cybersecurity risks. Those are all going to be additional expenditures that we have to make. And is that going to be the seller's responsibility, or is that going to be the buyer's responsibility? Some important things to talk about as you make your way through a transaction. Future operating expenses, we talked about that, to the extent that you need to shore up those policies and procedures surrounding cybersecurity, making sure you understand that the impact it has on future cash flows. And then somewhat of a hidden effort being post-transaction integration and all the soft costs that go along with integrating a business, an IT environment that lacks those proper security protocols. It's going to take a lot of effort to integrate that business into the buyer's environment. You certainly don't want to bring their environment to ours if those controls are lacking. And so all the attention that takes away from the actual integration and running that business for profit is going to be absorbed in trying to integrate the cybersecurity issues of that particular target. So that's what I had, Carolyn, for formal commentary on financial considerations. I think we'll turn it over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Mark. I'm going to kind of emphasize what Mark said, that really IT hygiene, overall information technology support is one thing that's really not front and center in a lot of these acquisition transactions, and certainly cybersecurity overlaying the information technology piece is important. So I'm going to break this down sort of from a seller side. Are we in the right slide? Yeah. So some of the things that a buyer wants to look at when he's looking at a seller and their environment from an information security perspective, right? It's really kind of looking at the overall IT hygiene of that company, of the seller's environment. Doing as much due diligence as you can regarding their overall information security posture. This would include things about and around information governance. How do they essentially take data into their environment? How do they create data within their environment? How do they move it around? Where does it end up? How do they store it? How do they back it up? Where do they know where this is? I can tell you from experience in doing digital forensic incident response investigations, we're able pretty quickly to determine that an adversary or bad actor gained access to their network. But then at that point, we ask, so where is all the really important stuff? And oftentimes, and I'm sure Kevin will talk about this too, the answer is it's everywhere, or we don't know. It's literally both on servers on-prem, it could be in cloud environments, it could be on local laptops. And the problem we have today is that Apple and Microsoft has made it very easy to share information across multiple devices, right? Our phones, our iPads, our laptops, our cloud environment. And so as a result, unfortunately, that presents tremendous challenges for companies to get their arms around exactly where their data is and what kind of data they have and need to protect. Also looking at just from a good practices perspective, how are you backing your data up? Can you recover from a ransomware attack? How quickly can you recover? And how long is that stuff stored? So as part of this due diligence, just on the information security side, and good, overall IT hygiene perspective is let's review their disaster recovery program. It's not just a policy, it's a program. And let's review the results of any test runs that they've done over the last couple of years. Again, I think Kevin will put an exclamation point on this, but there's been numerous times where we get involved in a DFIR investigation and get called in early on a ransomware case. And they say, yeah, we can back up from backups, only to find out that their last good backup was like last July. And nobody's checked it, nobody's looked at it, and they had no idea that they're literally 6 months behind on their backups. That's a problem, obviously. So, looking at those results, making sure that they have a robust backup process and program, and that they can actually recover from any kind of security incident. Looking at cloud, I mean, a lot of companies, probably a lot of people on this call, have either a hybrid approach or they've moved completely into the cloud. Some companies have still on-prem resources, others are a hybrid of both. And so looking at those cloud contracts and those environments, what's the duration of that contract? What are the costs associated with it? Is there any indemnification clauses within those contracts with those cloud providers? And I can tell you in most cases, the cloud providers are really good at kind of insulating themselves from liability when it comes to the data, your data that they're storing there. So it's important to look at those and understand sort of what their obligations might be in the event of some sort of a security incident. Reviewing employee information security awareness and training programs. I mean, are the employees within that seller's environment being trained? Are they testing out of security best practices? Types of policies. Does the company have an online phishing campaign in place that they use and regularly deploy to test and to educate and sort of bring the standard of their employees' knowledge and around information and information security. So looking at all those things is important to kind of get a little deeper into the seller's overall IT hygiene. Does the seller even have an incident response plan? If they do, review it. Take a look at what they're identifying as potential shortcomings or potential risks, and look at what their plan is with respect to recovering from some sort of security. Again, so overall due diligence on there's the cybersecurity policies. Here we're overlaying cybersecurity best practices on top of an information technology best practices and good hygiene with respect to that. So, what is their posture from a cybersecurity perspective? I mean, it's great to have all these IT policies and procedures and updated servers, infrastructure refresh type operations where their servers are running the latest version of the operating system, that they have a great and robust patch management program in place, whether they're doing it in-house or whether they're outsourcing to a third-party MSP. Really what you're trying to do is evaluate their cybersecurity maturity and management. Do they have things in place? Have they had a risk assessment done by a third party? If so, take a look at it. How often have they had risk assessments done? Where do they think, or where do these third parties that have done and performed these risk assessments, where do they think some of the potential exposure exists in their program? Vulnerability assessments and pen tests. I mean, if the company is, if you say, can you show me your last vulnerability assessment and pen test, and they go, what's that? You probably need to take a really deep look at what you're doing here with respect to acquiring this company, because this has become really the only way to look for the silent killers within an environment. I mean, we analogize vulnerability assessments and pen tests much like your annual physical. And if you ask me when was the last time I had a physical, and I say I've never had a physical, or the last physical I had was 5 years ago, you think that's crazy, right? I mean, it's the only way to test for silent killers within your body. High A1C, high PSA, liver enzymes, all those types of things. And you do it, and then you get the results, and the doctor says, hey, your cholesterol is a little high, I'm going to prescribe this statin. Take this for the next 12 months, come back, and we'll look at you again. It's the same, really the same kind of analogy can be made with respect to home pen tests. If you're not performing these regularly, at least annually, some companies do them biannually, some do them quarterly, you really have no idea what's going on within your environment and what kind of exposure risks exist within that environment. So you're really trying to get to this overall risk profile and understanding, as Mark said, are we trying to handle this stuff pre-transaction, or are we kind of leaving it to the post-transaction to kind of try to figure it out? And that can become somewhat problematic. And really, you're trying to evaluate the readiness and ability to comply with the key security principles to make sure that what you're buying is in a good place, so that you can rest assured that you've got at least some of the things covered from an IT hygiene perspective and from the cybersecurity perspective. This is by no means an all exhaustive or inclusive list. I just tried to kind of focus on some of the key and high points with respect to this. So, again, you want to look at any third-party relationships. Do they have a complete self-sustained internal IT staff, or do they have a kind of a hybrid where they have one person and they use an MSP or a managed security provider or managed service provider to provide some of those functions? Do they have web applications? A lot of companies either home grow some of their web applications to do the job and to sell the products and services that they do. And have they done any kind of web application pen testing? If so, take a look at what's been the results of those and what remediation steps were taken to remedy any potential exposure or risk there. Cyber liability insurance, I know Reggie Dejean is going to talk at length about this, but do they even have a cyber liability policy? If not, again, that would be a red flag and something to be concerned about. But even if they do, you're going to learn that there's no two cyber liability insurance policies are created equal. And really dependent upon the industry they're in and the type of risks they potentially have within their environment, that policy, it's got a lot of different moving parts and ways to kind of protect them and you as a buyer against some potential exposure. There's a ton more IT related due diligence. How many laptops do they have in the environment? How many are older than 3 years old that need to be replaced? Are they still running Windows 7? How many licenses do we got to buy to get them up to Windows 10 or 11? Infrastructure refresh. Are they running old servers and old operating systems with respect to their infrastructure? So there's tons and tons of things that from a financial perspective and then ultimately kind of from a legal perspective also need to be considered in addition to the things I talked about here. But at the end of the day, reviewing the IT hygiene as well as their cybersecurity kind of overlay of that infrastructure really allows you to evaluate in a much clearer light, is this a good transaction? I mean, are we putting ourselves at high risk or ultimate exposure? This can allow for renegotiation of sale price. Mark and Kevin can talk more about that. A sound sort of comprehensive reps and warranty language that comes along with the transaction, and maybe possibly even reps and warranty insurance if there's some concerns there, or an increase in the cyber liability coverage that they have at closing. We do this in real estate transactions all the time, right? So you want to buy a house, you have an inspector go in, they come back with not so great of a review. And, you know, the seller can buy home insurance to kind of cover you as the buyer for the next year, right? In case the furnace goes or the roof goes or whatever. So there's ways to kind of address it, and it's similar in this type of a transaction. On the seller side, pre-sale, everything I talked about is really good practices as you're ramping up for a sale of your company. These are things that can increase the value of your company, help a potential buyer and seller slide through a transaction and a sale. So again, kind of going back to good IT hygiene and cybersecurity overlays with investing in if you're going to sell your company in 3 years or 5 years, these are things that good practice things that you should be thinking about and considering to kind of put your company in a better position, to make it more marketable, make it more valuable. Having a robust information security program. I'm not talking about an information security policy. I'm talking about all the things that go into an information security program, like vulnerability management, backup and retention, information governance. Where is the stuff being kept and how are you protecting it? Having good sound policies, mapping to some recognized information security framework like NIST or ISO or Center for Information Security. These types of things help guide companies in employing and deploying the right types of technology and process and procedure to kind of get them in a better spot. I already talked about information governance policy in a program, annual risk assessments, annual golden pens. These are things you should be doing in anticipation of a potential sale down the road to put you in a better position and maybe increase the value of the sale. Do you have endpoint detection and response technology? We refer to them as EDRs or XDRs. These are basically technology that sits on every device within your environment and looks for anomalous behavior. The days of firewalls and antivirus are long gone. That's just not enough today. So, having some of these additional overlays of security to actually monitor and look for anomalous behavior, be able to, as Mark said, detect. We gave up on prevention years ago. We punted prevention. We know we can't prevent, right? So really the exercise in the game today is detection, detect as quickly as possible, and have a comprehensive and immediate response plan ready to go. In all the, the Verizon data breach report that gets done every year, they all tie the costs of recovering from a security incident to the ability to detect it quickly. The quicker you can detect it and take some action against it, the less it's going to cost you in the long run. If these people have been running around in your environment for months and have already taken your data, and then they blow you up on the way out with a ransomware attack, and you're able to recover from your backups, and you can say, I'm not going to pay the ransom. Well, they say, well, let me just give you a little proof of life. Here's some of the stuff we took already. Are you sure you don't want to pay? Because if not, we're going to release this stuff. So it's become a really wild, wild west with respect to our adversaries. Again, looking at documentation of those data recovery processes and the employee training program is so critical. I think everybody on this panel will tell you that really the biggest risk and the biggest exposure we have is our people. So we really need to make a concerted effort to make sure that those folks are trained up, aware of the issues and the concerns and phishing emails and other things. So I think that's all I have, Caroline. And I'm going to turn it over to Kevin here, who we've worked with many, many times, and most of the time successfully and with a very happy ending, other times not so much.
Mike, actually, I wanted to just sort of make a comment here on cybersecurity, so kind of touch on the legal side too. One of the things that we touch on are trying to help our clients identify key employees and trying to lock them and incentivize them to stay with the business as a buyer. And one of the things that you touched on a little bit, which maybe comment a little bit more on, when the transaction occurs, if you have a key employee that's disgruntled, right, the risk of loss of intellectual property and data. You said they'll lay a bomb and blow up your system, after they leave. I mean, I don't know if you have any horror stories there, or
I do, and Kevin and I have worked on a few of these cases where the key guy, the key employee, is the director of IT, and he's disgruntled or she's disgruntled, and not happy with this transaction, and they end up leaving, and they take all the keys to the kingdom. right? I mean, you've seen these too, Mark. I know you have too, right? Where now they're changing their defacing your website, they're changing access for key executive leaders to gain information that they need. So it's a major problem to identify those people and have some sort of remedies in place to try to minimize that exposure risk, because it does exist and it happens, unfortunately more often than not with some of these things.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to have access and identity management, so that when someone is in your organization, you know who they are, what they're doing, and what time they're doing it, so you can track that anomalous activity. So we're going to talk about legal considerations. Let's stay on this on the title page for a moment, Carolyn. I just want to underscore a couple of things that Mark and Mike have talked about. First of all, everything we're talking about on this podcast, to talk about how you're going to review an M&A transaction, they also double as great tips, industry practices for how you can maintain good cyber hygiene. Because when you're dealing with a transaction of this sort, that's what the buyer is going to be looking for, and that's what the seller is going to be representing and warranting as part of the asset purchase agreement or the stock purchase agreement. So it doubles as advice for great cyber hygiene. Another quick point I want to make before we go into our slides is that today we are all about the magic words and the magic bullet. And I think we've done a great service. Those of us in the cyber industry, we've done a great service, but also what we've done creates a little bit of risk. And that is, there are these buzzwords. You feel that if you have MFA or multi-factor authentication, or if your data is in the cloud, or if you have strong passwords or endpoint detection, you're set. And you don't have to worry about anything. That's not really true. What you should be thinking about, sort of non-sexy concepts that you want to be thinking about as an organization, really get you started on comprehensive cyber hygiene. It's going to help make your transaction more cost-effective and fraught with less risk. Two things: data inventory and risk assessment. Data inventory is kind of like the 5 W's that we learned in journalism when we were in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. It's like, what data do you have? Why do you have it? Is it something that you don't need to keep? Who has access to it? Why do they have access to it? When are you purging data that you no longer need? And do you know about all the data you have? Because you can't protect what you don't know exists. And risk assessment is critically important. What you're looking at, you are literally sitting down, you're looking at your hardware and software and data and employees and thinking about what are the daily and what are the existential risks to your organization, and what are you doing to manage that risk. And as Mike says, not necessarily prevent it, because we're not really going to be able to do that anymore, but what are you doing to manage it and to ensure that you can turn around and restore normal business operations as soon as possible. All right, so with that, let's turn to our first slide. I promise you we're not going to go through, it will not, hopefully not offend you if we don't go through every single thing on every one of my slides. If it does offend you, there's a place to comment, and I will go back and we can extend this by another 30 minutes or so and do it. All kidding aside, Mike has touched on some of these things, but when we start the process of legal due diligence for an M&A transaction, we're looking at some or all of these factors. And let me just hit the highlights. The first thing we want to know is, does your organization have PII, or personally identifiable information? Do you have those names, addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses, social security numbers, financial account information, driver's license numbers, those things that we know are protected by the laws of every state in which you are doing business, not just the state you're incorporated in, but if you have customers in other states, those states count too. So we're looking at those. If you collect payments by credit card, we're looking at the PCI DSS, that's the payment card industry's data security standard. The Visa, MasterCard, they all, American Express, they have special and very involved requirements for protection of data, including financial data. So we want to know that. We want to know about what security controls you have in place. So we're going to ask if we're representing the buyer. So this is buyer driven, at least at the outset. we're going to be asking what security controls you have in place. And so we're going to be asking about MFA. We're going to be asking about endpoint detection and response. And if your answer is, oh, we don't have a problem because all of our data is in the cloud, I think Reggie's going to address one of those questions later. If your answer is all of our data is in the cloud, so we don't have to worry about that, two things are going to come up. Number one, we're going to say, how mature is this organization's cybersecurity? Because if you think all our data is in the cloud answer is sufficient, it's not, because you're still responsible for that data, even though it's in the cloud. We're going to get a sense that maybe this organization doesn't have the kinds of security controls that a typical organization would have. We're going to be identifying those unrecorded liabilities, if you will, as Mark suggested. We're also going to be, let's sort of skip down to third-party vendors and cyber incidents, because Mike has touched on a couple of these other elements. We're going to be looking for the relationships that you have with other vendors, and we're going to want to see the contracts, and we're going to want to look at what, if any, data security, indemnification, and insurance provisions that you have in your contracts. Why? Because when it comes to cybersecurity, you're not only responsible for your own cyber hygiene, but increasingly by contract or by law, you may be responsible for your vendors' cyber hygiene as well. And regulators and your due diligence lawyers on the other side are going to ask you questions about that.
Hey, Kevin, if I could just jump in.
Yeah.
We did have a question actually surrounding, I think, vendor contracts. It was posted by one of the, I don't know if you wanted to take a quick read through that. Reggie, this could be one that maybe talks about.
Let's take a look.
Cyber insurance.
So it's from Yes, and I know the answer too. Thanks, Chris. So the software, my software vendor has a limitation of liability clause in its contract that limits its liability to 2 months of fees, not an uncommon limitation. Does this present a waiver of subrogation problem with my cyber insurance, and how can I deal with the problem? So a lot in that question, but it's a great question, and I'm happy to talk to you offline about it, Chris, but I would say the short answer is potentially yes. If you've got a limitation of liability, and your sole ability to recover from the vendor, or your limitation of liability is 2 months. So let's say it's $10,000 a month, it's $20,000. If all you can recover from your vendor is $20,000 and you've got a waiver of subrogation, then the question becomes, will you or your insurance carrier be able to go after the ultimately responsible party and get a penny more than what you are entitled to under your contract? That does present a problem. There may be some ways around that, but the short answer is if you could tweak the waiver of subrogation provision to permit recovery, that's one way around it. I know in many cases that's not possible. So great question. That is a really interesting issue, and I look forward to talking to you more about it.
I'd just like to jump in real quick,
Yeah.
and I'm pretty sure Reggie Dejean is going to cover this too. But how frequent is it now, Reggie, where you can actually negotiate the amount of fees paid? So instead of 2 months, you can say I want 10 months or I want 12 months, and as part of that contract negotiation with that third-party vendor, there may be other ways to kind of get some additional relief.
It really comes down to your relationship with the vendor.
Right.
I mean, if they're a $1 billion company and you're a $2 million operation, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of leverage there. But if it's the other way around, then you certainly have leverage. If you look at one of your vendors could be Google or Microsoft, chances are they're not going to amend the
Right.
contract.
No,
So it's
that's
just
right.
something to be aware of.
The other thing to think about too is that you have a contractual limitation of liability, as this question presents. But if you have a tort claim, again, if you're trying to preserve a business relationship, this may not be the way to go, but oftentimes you've got a knockdown drag out. So if you're in a dispute with a vendor and it's not going to be resolved amicably, one way around the contractual limitations period limitation and the waiver of subrogation might be a tort claim. So if you have a claim against the vendor for fraud, because you say that, well, I entered into an agreement with you because I thought you had certain security controls in place to protect me, it's clear that you didn't, and you knew that before I signed, then I have a fraud claim against that vendor, and that's not going to be subject to the contractual limitations period under the laws of many states. So there are ways around this, depends on the particular facts, but great question. All right, just to wrap up this slide, keep moving, but please jump in. That was interesting. Raise your hand if you found communication among the panelists interesting. No, last question we're going to ask about our cyber incidents. And I will tell you, there's an often common scenario. We'll go through our due diligence, and the seller will say, no, we don't have any PII, it's all in the cloud. They don't have adequate security controls, but they say they've had no cyber incidents in the last 3 years. And I have to tell you that many of us, when we're going through the due diligence process, we doubt that that is true. Not that you're not being honest, but that you may not realize that you've had cyber incidents because you don't have the controls in place to really quantify that. Let's go to the next slide, Carolyn. Let's talk a little bit about Part 500 due diligence. So what's Part 500? Part 500 is the New York State Department of Financial Services cybersecurity regulation. So if you're a covered entity, which means if you are subject to charter, permit, or license under the New York State banking law, insurance law, or other financial services laws, you are subject to this regulation. And even if you're not subject to this regulation, if you are a third-party service vendor, so you are somebody who does business with a covered entity, you're going to, as for all practical purposes, you're going to be subject to these regulations as well. You should pay attention to them. We do in the due diligence process, because a covered entity is going to want to make sure that the vendors with which it does business are compliant, that they have adequate safeguards in place. So I just want to do a quick rundown on Part 500. And again, here you see up front importance of a risk assessment. And why, again, if you're still wondering, as I sometimes do, why is he talking about this regulation if I'm not subject to it? Well, number one, if you're a covered entity, you are. Number two, if you're doing business with a covered entity, you are. And number three, dirty little secret about federal and state regulators, they are not industry leaders when it comes to imposing standards. So when you read a law and you see the information security requirements and other requirements that are built into that law or regulation, you can bet that those requirements have been around for a long time, and they may well reflect industry standards. Like MFA is not important because the state of New York's cybersecurity regulation says it is. MFA has been important for many years now, so another good reason to pay attention to it. So Part 500 imposes a series of physical and electronic security controls, including, as Mike points out, an incident response plan. So if you're sitting there thinking, what's an incident response plan? That's something we're going to pick up in the due diligence process, and we're going to have a red flag about that. And when the insurer has a due diligence call near the end of the transaction, and Reggie's on the call and the insurance underwriter's on the call, and they ask me as a lawyer to tell them whether I'm satisfied that the company to be acquired or the assets to be acquired has adequate security controls in place, I've got to be able to say yes to that. And if I can't say yes, then that has the potential to delay the transaction or increase the cost of the transaction. Let's flip to the next slide. Carolyn, thank you. Quick note on coming changes to New York cybersecurity regulation. There are some big changes coming this year. We just saw the second round of proposed amendments in January. The comment period is expired, so any day now, we are going to see a new and improved cybersecurity regulation. Just wanted to hit the highlights, and here they are. So the state of New York is going to be, and therefore, if you're doing business with a covered entity, your business partners are going to be looking to increased asset inventory, access controls. In other words, who has access to your system? What data do they have access to? How are you monitoring and limiting that access to make sure that only those people that need it have access to it? So one kind of crazy example, your CEO is the CEO, but she does not necessarily need access to every part of your computer network or system. So if you have confined the access to only those who truly need it, you're limiting your exposure, you're making the due diligence process here a lot easier. Going forward this year, we're going to see greater role and responsibility for CISOs. What's a CISO? If you're asking that question in the due diligence process, that's going to be something we're going to know. A CISO is a Chief Information Security Officer. So you either have a CISO or you have someone in your organization who serves the role of Chief Information Security Officer. Then as part of the due diligence process, excuse me, we're going to know that you have at least some substantial controls in place. There is someone in your organization that is reviewing the status of your physical, electronic, and legal safeguards. And going forward, CISOs are going to be empowered with not only the power of management, but the power of the purse. The regulation is going to require that CISOs have sufficient financial resources to execute the cybersecurity program and the cybersecurity policies. Governance, going forward, you're going to have someone with cybersecurity expertise on your board of directors. That's probably going to be an information technology or information security person. I'm not sure if it could be a lawyer if the lawyer has sufficient expertise, but this is not a box checking exercise. This is, they want to know, regulators want to know that you have someone with some expertise who's able to drive discussions on the board. And finally, coming soon, it won't just be your information security professional, your CISO, who has to certify your compliance with regulation. Your CEO is going to have to certify compliance. There's a new, almost Orwellian change to this regulation. It is going to permit you going forward to advise state regulators that you are not currently compliant with one or more areas, as long as you identify the areas and identify your next steps for coming into compliance. We can talk offline about whether you really want to be in the position of telling the state of New York that you're not in compliance with the regulation. Probably best to get in compliance before you certify. And Carolyn, let's go to our next slide and we can wrap up. So once we've gone through and done our due diligence, we peeked into your system. If you're in the cloud, we've looked at your cloud service contracts. We've satisfied ourselves that we understand what the strengths and weaknesses of your information security are. We're going to be focusing on at least several of the asset purchase agreement provisions, and here they are. So we're going to look at whatever it's called. Sometimes it's called, your data security protections are embedded in an IP or intellectual property section. We're going to be looking at marking up and in some cases redrafting for you data, reps and warranties, indemnification, and insurance provisions of your contracts, so that if you're the seller, you're not promising more than you can deliver. And if you're the buyer, you have as many safeguards and reps and warranties in place as you need, so that if something goes wrong, you have a risk transfer mechanism. In other words, you can go back to the seller and say, hey, you said this, it turns out not to be true, so we're entitled to some compensation remedy, and the security for that risk transfer is your reps and warranties insurance. And that may be the perfect time to segue over to Reggie Dejean.
Thanks, Kevin. So you've heard a lot about what's going on. I guess I'll try to sum up. I try to come up with a word or some analogy that might at least kind of summarize what we're doing here. I guess what I would say is termites. So that's what we're trying to protect you against, right? So you have we talked about all the different inspections that you do, vulnerability testing, and really what you want to do is make sure that you're looking at really the cyber concerns, which a normal review of the operations may not tell you unless you look for the termites. In this case, it's going to be the cybersecurity exposure that you have. So what is cybersecurity insurance? Basically, it's coverage for liabilities arising out of unauthorized access to personal and confidential information. We talked a lot about PII. There's also protected health information, which is even more critical. And then there's also general business information, which a lot of our clients don't always think about. You may have confidential, if you're a lawyer or an accountant, you may have some good financial information on a company that you don't necessarily want to have out there to the public. So if someone gains access to that, they can hold you hostage from a cyber extortion standpoint. These coverages are not added to or included in the general liability policy. We still have some clients that will ask us, well, I have a general liability policy, doesn't that protect me? And the answer is no. Specifically by exclusion, if you look at your general liability policy, it'll say that it will not cover anything related to theft of equipment, hacking, deception, or any type of misrepresentation like that. So it would not be covered under your GL policy. So some of the common coverages for cybersecurity include network and privacy security. That's pretty self-explanatory. That's the third-party liability portion. That is the long-term. I guess if I want to summarize that, that is something that people may sue you for at some point in time down the road if that information is leaked out. But some of the concerns that your business should really look at, which is what we refer to in insurance as first-party coverage, that would be the actual cost to mitigate the breach or the incident. We always want to say it's an incident. Never want to say it's a breach. Mike will give me a smack.
It may not be, because it may not be.
Right, exactly. So you don't want to cause the state or any other government agency to come in and take a look at you. You always want to refer to it as.
And you certainly don't want to be sending emails to your people saying, we've been breached,
Yeah.
right, Kevin?
Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
And that's something to think about down the road is we talked about the incident response plan, is who's going to be the spokesperson for the company. You want to make sure that those emails, if you do send emails out to people in the company, make sure they're labeled as confidential information, because we've seen situations where someone likes to have the press have access to information and they'll send the email on. Again, it's not going to protect you completely, but at least it gives a little bit of emphasis of what the security measures are with the company. So the first party coverages would be there's a breach coach that could be a legal firm or somebody in that capacity who's going to walk through the process. And the reason why you want to have someone like Kevin involved right away is because he's going to hire somebody like Mike or Mark to do some security analysis or an inventory analysis of what we have here. And you want that information to be considered privileged and confidential. So that's why you want to make sure you have a breach coach and a legal person involved in this from the beginning. And that takes care of the notification costs if you have anything down the road, credit monitoring, the public relations, again, we talked about making sure you have somebody designated to be the spokesperson for the company. The cyber extortion and ransom demands, those are usually in cryptocurrency, even though Bitcoin is not doing so well these days, but people still want to be paid in something that's not going to be easily accessible from the government as far as clawing back the fees or the money that you have paid somebody. Business interruption, again, that's something overlooked a lot of times. Mike could attest to this, that most businesses will be down a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks, if not significantly more. It could be months, and that's a lot of payroll and sales that you are not able to recoup, and that business interruption is something you want to keep in mind. Social engineering, I think many people are familiar with that. That's where you get the email from the CEO who's out of the country saying that please mail or send a payment for $1 million to this account, and you don't double check with that, and you send it, and it turns out to be a big oops, and not the oops that you want to tell your CEO or CFO that you've committed. So that social engineering or fraudulent inducement of making that false payment, it can be covered under a cyber policy and also on the crime policy. And then the media liability, sometimes people don't think about that, but you have chat rooms, especially these days where people can be offended with the drop of a hat. So they will come after you because of information that was on the website, maybe information about them, personal information that they feel should be out there. Going to the next slide, just going through some concerns or cyber questions that are out there. Why would someone target a small company? Only large companies are what the criminals want to go after. Sure, those are the big paydays, but they're not always looking for the big payday. They are certainly at times, but they're looking for the steady eddy, that the income that's going to be the doubles and singles and doubles that are going to keep them going. So if they can go to a company, easily shut them down because they may not have the proper security measures in place, they'll ask for, it used to be $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. Now it's pretty much that they're going to be 6 figures or more that they're asking for from a ransom demand. And as was mentioned before, if you decide not to pay, they will let you know what information they have. And you have to be faced with the decision of, are you going to look your customer in the face and tell them, I could have possibly prevented that information being put out there in the dark web, but I decided not to make that payment. That's a public relations decision that you really need to make with a lot of guidance. But yep.
And Reggie, can I just, forgive me for interrupting. You've got these standard questions they come up all the time. There's one I wanted to ask you that I've been getting a lot, and that is, I will get a call from a client who will say, yes, we have cyber insurance, but we've had a cyber incident. We're not sure if it's a breach yet. should we notify our carrier? We have this insurance in place, but there's concern on the part of the client that if they notify the carrier, they're going to lose their coverage, or they may not need the coverage, or if the ransomware demand isn't covered anyway, why do I need to provide notice? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so unlike the property policy or auto policy where you get into a fender bender, you know kind of what the cost would be, and you decide not to report that. Same thing with property. If you have some damage, water damage or fire damage, you know what the cost would be. You just don't know what the ultimate cost will be with the cyber incident that turns into a breach. So we certainly recommend that you advise the insurance company of what's going on. They will be able to help the process. There are different policies, as we talked about. Some policies will allow you to work with your own firm and forensic firm and law firm. Other policies will kind of mandate who you go to. That is probably more common than not. So make sure that you understand how your policy is going to respond. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't work with somebody that you know, but just understand that those costs may not be reimbursed if a situation comes up. And if it's really important to you, make sure that your agent or representative knows that that is something that you're frankly willing to pay a little bit more for by having somebody that you know deal with the incident or a breach. So yes, that's you always want to make sure that you're reporting the incident. It's not like a policies where you can just kind of deal with the costs. You don't know what they ultimately may be. Just looking at some of the information we mentioned before, as far as the data in the cloud, third-party vendor. We talked about the contracts before. There's going to be some limitations on how much the vendor is going to pay, particularly if it's a cloud provider, and it might be to the value of the contract, and we talked about either months or the full year value, but it is not going to pay the potential millions of dollars that you have to pay if you ultimately have a breach. IT team has me covered. We already have measures, including multi-factor authentication. So two things there. IT is always tasked with trying to make things easier for employees. So one program talking to another, and how do they get those to communicate with each other? And that is, and they do that well. But sometimes the security measures are something that they may not feel as comfortable with, or just have the skill set to be able to do that. So you want to make sure that you're working with a firm, and because of the requirements, the legal requirements, it probably has to be independent analysis of your system, vulnerability or penetration tests. So keep that in mind as you're putting a lot of onus on your IT team that maybe it's not fairly put on them. And all the information is backed up, and you can be up and running in a couple of days. We talked about the cyber extortion and ransom demand, that even if you're back up and running, they may have the information and they can hold that over you. But you'll be surprised at how many companies think they can be back up and running in a couple hours or a day or a few days, and it takes them, as Mike was saying, either weeks or months to
They
get
can't
back.
do it at all.
Or they can't do it at all. Absolutely.
We've seen examples of regulated entities in New York who want to be back up and running, but the regulator will say, no, you can't do it yet until you check certain boxes and confirm for us that you're safe.
Yeah, you may be reinstalling the actual malware or infection that got you in that place in the first place.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about what's considered private information. So we'll go to the next screen just to give you some stats. But 35% of ransomware attacks are targeted at companies that are under 100 employees. So again, we talked about my company is too small. Why would they come after me? It's because you might be easier to get access to than a larger company. But it's still, with that said, 44% of ransom is companies with 1,000 or less employees. So things that you need to be aware of. And then the targeted sectors, obviously professional services, they have a lot of personal information, business information. Public sector was hammered early on. They've done a lot of things to help protect themselves, but they're still big targets, as is healthcare. I think healthcare it was probably healthcare and the public sector that was one or two as far as by these cyber criminals, if you want to call it that. Let's move on to the third slide, because I know we're kind of running up against the clock and we're going to allow time for some questions. But we talked about all this already, but have an incident response plan in place, know who's on the team. If you have it, have a physical copy of the incident response plan, have a physical copy of your cyber insurance policy, because guess what? When your system's down, you can't retrieve it. So you want to make sure that you have all the people involved in the incident response team should have a copy of at least the declaration page for an insurance policy, so you know who to contact, and also the incident response plan, so you can actually do what you said you're going to do and hopefully train do it. Take advantage of some of the loss mitigation services available. They are limited to some degree with the insurance companies. They're not going to be as robust as what Mike can do or others can do, but at least it's something that you can start with and train your employees. You just train. The greatest vulnerability and the greatest asset all in one, and make sure that you're doing some type of training and testing with your employees as far as just falling victim to the phishing emails, and they are out there everywhere. So I'll just kind of wrap up with that. I went through that fast. I apologize for that, but just wanted to keep mind of the time and see if there's any questions that may be out there.
Sorry, Reggie, always the last person somehow gets to talk the fastest.
Just remember termites.
I like it.
One thing away.
Easy to remember. So just a question I want to kind of pose to you guys. It's kind of maybe a twofold question of, if I am that small or medium business and, who do I call first to set this up or to even check what I already have in place to make sure it's adequate and covering everything? Which of my professional experts, partners, vendors, who do I call first?
That's a great question. So if there's a cyber incident, the first person you want to call is your lawyer. And the reason you want to do that is because you want to protect your communications, but with the attorney-client privilege. Now, if you haven't had an incident, you're sitting here and you're saying, I just really connected with Mike McCartney and Reggie Dejean today, and I want to go through a cyber checkup. You don't have to contact your lawyer first. What I would suggest is you really could contact any one of us. You contact an insurance company, your insurance broker, like Reggie. Reggie might say, you know what, that thing you want to do, there's actually some money under your insurance policy that can defray the cost, and here's a list of potential forensic firms that can do it. You can call Mike because Mike McCartney is an expert in this area. Mike has done these forensic reviews. You can call Mark because Mark has managed so many of these M&A transactions and helped clients with auditing their internal controls that he's going to know. He may be able to help you directly, or he may say, you know what, we can help you, but we need to engage a forensic firm to help too. And last but not least, you can always call the lawyer because the lawyer is your coach. The lawyer has access to all of these resources, and the lawyer can make recommendations to you. If you haven't done it, if you haven't had an outside audit, I highly recommend it because it's important. They're going to pick up things that your IT staff, they're not doing. They're your IT staff. They're not the information security people. So there's good reason to do it. And heaven forbid, something bad happens and you have to give notice to a regulator, and the regulators call you and they want to investigate. If you can answer yes to the question, whether you've ever had an independent audit, it makes the regulatory process go a little bit smoother.
No, that's great, because I'm sure a lot of people think they are doing it right or they've got everything covered. Have some exposures they're just not aware of. And I kind of like Mike's example of, my doctor's appointment and my medical of, that preventive care and making sure before something happens, we're checking on things.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that a little bit. And it's critically important to really get an assessment of your information security posture and your cybersecurity posture. But I can tell you, I've sat across from business owners countless times. And the answer to, hey, would you like to increase your cybersecurity program by adding EDR, for example, or having a robust vulnerability management place to make sure that things are getting patched and patched appropriately and so forth. And they said, well, not really, because I have cyber liability insurance. I'm like, well, that's great. You also have auto insurance, but that doesn't mean you purposely drive on the other side of the yellow lane and you smash into a car head-on, right? Or drive it through a Tim Hortons front window.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You don't want to use your cyber liability insurance.
And you're supposed to lose it. And if you don't have controls in place, you have cyber insurance, I guarantee you, the next time around, if you don't lose it, it's going to be a lot more expensive and the coverage is going to be less.
Or you may be completely uninsurable. Like, how would you like to go to your boss and say, we're uninsurable?
Or if you don't have the proper controls, the coverage might not kick in, right? It might not cover it.
And even for this discussion, you might not be sellable.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to keep in mind, it's weird for an insurance guy to say this, but the best insurance policy is the policy is never used.
That's right.
And, we talked about the auto accident, what kind of pains you go through with getting a rental car these days when you have, parts and everything else, the limitations on getting the car up and running again. Same thing with your business. You just don't know what the cost may be, and what the chip shortage is. To get a laptop replacement is still an issue. So those are the things that you don't think about all the time. But again, you want to be as safe as you can be. Make sure that you've tested your systems and have insurance, which you want to try to.
And you're right, Carolyn, we have seen, I'm sure we've all seen transactions that are either delayed or they're canceled because a question comes up and you just can't get over it. There's no way to manage that risk in a way that saves the deal.
Exactly. We are at 11 o'clock. We will stay on another minute or two. If anybody has additional questions, just throw them in the question box. Keep in mind too, there is the post-survey, webinar survey that you'll receive when you do hang up with this, and you can post any questions in there, or again, request a time to talk with somebody further one-on-one. So our experts are here to help you, guide you, provide some information, so definitely take advantage of that. I want to thank you guys, as you know, kind of we wait for any last minute questions to come in, but thank you for your time, your expertise. This was so helpful to so many companies. We had a great group on with us today, and thank you for joining us. I'll just do a quick 2-second round of any last minute thoughts. Mike, you're sitting next to me, so I'll give it to you first.
Really, just in general, go get your physical. You know, understand where you're at, sort of what your current state is, and then looking at all the sort of external moving parts, whether it's Part 500, whether it's just good, renewing an insurance policy that's coming up, moving towards from a current state to a future state. That's better to position yourself to sell a company or to understand what it is you're buying.
Thank you, Reggie.
What I'll say is that you probably heard one thing today that really made you uneasy. Act on that. Do something with that. Don't just, you don't have to tackle everything at once, but just make one step at a time, and you'll be on the path to securing your information better than you are now.
Great.
Yeah, I think from a transaction standpoint, if you're the buyer, obviously sufficient due diligence and understanding what those risks are. If you're the seller, get ready. Because, if you try to get your house in order, it's like selling a house. You cut the lawn, you make sure the roof isn't leaking. Get that house in order before you take it to market, because if there's a risk that's identified once diligence is started, it can significantly impact the timing and valuation of business.
Great.
Termites. I love it. For every one you see, there are 1,000 you don't. And it's a great metaphor for cyber. You can get rid of those termites before the transaction comes up. It will go much more smooth.
That's awesome. So the 4 things I wrote down for the takeaways is act, annual exam, termites, and be prepared. Thank you, guys. Thanks for being with us today. Have a great day.